Hello everyone, welcome back to Alkaline Hydroxide 784. I never recycle my audios here on this channel, and you can hear interesting noises from outside. Okay, but yeah, no one really asked about it. And I also don't really recycle bad puns, I just make more of them. And all of you know the same occurs with real life trash. And well, that's on a much, much larger scale. So yeah, we all know where this is going. Why can't we just recycle them? Why do so many plastic bottles and supposedly recyclable things actually end up in the landfill? What if I said recycling may not always be the best option? What if I said recycling may actually be worse in some cases? Well, okay, before I start sounding like a clickbait title generator, let's get to the timings for today. Yeah, so as you can see the timings, let's dive right into the trash pile and tackle recycling. As we have insinuated from the team and the extremely alluring intro I just had. Yeah, we will be seeing how recycling is more than appearances. First up, let us understand what is the appearance part of it and basically how you view recycling, and then see what are the potential more than appearances stuff that you can get out of that. You'll understand it eventually. So, how do people view recycling? Well, that's what we're gonna find out now. But someone might say, recycling is a good thing, right? It helps us convert the waste back into useful products. And there's actually a lot of potential in recycling. You can recycle many types of plastic, glass, clean paper, metal, for sure, and much more. And to recycle isn't hard. Just put your stuff in the blue bins here in Singapore, or if you're in another place, you might need to sort it out, which shouldn't be that hard. And that seems simple enough. You get to save the planet that way, right? Okay, then let's look at the statistics for recycling. Oh, well, what do we have here? Hopelessness at its worst and major questions at its best. Is it a problem of people just not recycling enough, or in certain cases, industry is not recycling enough? Because there is a difference between household and industrial recycling. And actually, in Singapore, the industrial recycling is pretty good. It's just household recycling that's pretty bad. Or is there more to this seemingly innocent paragraph? So now let's look at the problems with the paragraph, or maybe the nuances that we may want to add to the paragraph, and understand more about recycling. So the paragraph says, yeah, you can make useful products with recycling, and yes, that is correct. Recycling does convert material into useful products, but is the product truly that useful? That is the main point. Like, how useful is the useful product? So generally, the quality of recycled material is maybe at most as good as the virgin material, which is the new material, or in worse cases, just worse quality as compared to virgin material. So, for example, if you think about it, glass and metal can, in theory, be infinitely recycled, but plastic is a place where it tends to become a bit not so great, because plastic generally can be recycled back to its original quality. So the quality does decrease with time, and you cannot use it for the same product usually. And even if you look at something like 3D printing, for example, like there's one kind of 3D printing that uses powder to print rather than a filament. And you might think, oh, okay, that's great. They can reuse the powder that is just excess and didn't actually get used. But the thing is, if the powder is too close to the product that you're printing, then it's not useful anymore. And the rest of the powder, you can't just use it as it is. You need to mix it with the new powder in a 50-50 ratio for it to actually work. So as you can see, even there you have some wastage. You cannot completely recycle everything. And I did mention that glass and metal can be recycled infinitely, but that has to be done carefully and correctly. And sometimes even for glass, the products that are made are not exactly the same as the original product. So it may end up not being as useful as you intended it to be. So I'll explain more on that later. So the second point that we can look at is what can actually be recycled, because the paragraph says you can recycle many types of this, that, and everything, right? So what can actually be recycled? Well, in theory, most materials that are not contaminated, that's in theory. Practically, it does differ, which I will tell in a minute. So what can actually be recycled depends on the material, what the product is actually used for, and whether we have the infrastructure or the bordersomeness to do it. So the material, well, yeah, glass and metal can be recycled infinitely, but there are exceptions to it. Even for glass, certain types like light bulbs and window panes need special recycling centers already. So that's the most important point. Special recycling center. That's the main point. And for metal, well, sometimes you don't recycle certain metals like mercury and lead. And you might be wondering, why do we even need to worry about mercury and lead? Well, you're still using them. There's mercury in some thermometers and some other applications, and lead is being used in certain applications as well. So they're not completely phased out, and you can't really recycle them. And also batteries in general have you can't just easily recycle them. You need to recycle them either through e-waste, or if they're not really e-waste, then it's quite hard to recycle them. So e-waste also requires a special recycling location. You cannot just recycle it with everything else. And of course, the big problem here is plastic. Well, because the problem here is that plastic is very, very diverse. You can, you know, the way that plastic is made is through polymerization, and you can polymerize many different, molecules in a sense, and make many different kinds of polymers which become plastics. And because of that, it's really hard to bring those molecules back to their building blocks and recycle them. Like, that's the only way to do it in some cases. And the other way that they do it is to melt them and use them, which kind of downcycling, not really recycling back to the same quality. So apart from that, it's also really hard to recycle very, very big pieces of plastic and very, very tiny pieces of plastic like microplastics. So there's this ideal size range of plastics that are generally used in recycling plants. And yeah, I know that sounds very layman, but that's actually how they do things. And you can see that there is this systematic issue, like it's not just about whether you can recycle it theoretically, but there's also practical restrictions as to what can be recycled. Yeah, so we look at that soon in terms of infrastructure. But before that, let's look at the second part of it, in which is how the product is used, like what the product was used for and whether you can actually recycle that. As you know, in Singapore, you don't go around putting your food container into the recycling bin unless it's washed and cleaned, because you don't really want food contamination and recycling. You can easily remove it in the plant, and the food may actually end up spreading even further if you dump it into the recycling bin and mix it around everything else. And apart from food contamination, another place in which you can really get recycling materials is the lab. Even though there's a lot of plastic stuff that's been used in the lab, you can recycle them, you have to burn them because they're considered biohazardous. And I don't think you really want that in your newly formed recycled plastic, whatever product that is, yeah. And apart from food or bio contamination, there's also chemical contamination that can occur, which is the case with containers used to contain hazardous chemicals. Remember the mercury and the lead being not recycled in general. So stuff like that, as well as other chemicals that are hazardous, you know, something like your acids and your alkalis and some other corrosive materials, you don't really want to use to recycle the container that was containing them. So that's another thing that can be recycled. And yeah, finally, infrastructure. So infrastructure is a big place in which there is a physical, practical constraint to being able to recycle everything. So yeah, the first thing is the idea of the infrastructure is to allow you to separate the product into all these little components and materials. Usually, how it's done is by literally breaking the product. So if it's like a complex product, you need to somehow break it apart so that you can get the different materials. And if you're trying to remove magnetic metals, it's very easy. Just use a big magnet and then pull out all the magnetic metals out. But for certain other materials, it's quite hard to retrieve all the teeny weeny bits and pieces that can be in, especially e-waste. E-waste has a lot of small components with different materials. So you need infrastructure for doing that. And also in general to separate out all of the trash in a certain stream of trash. So let's say even if you have a plastic recycling bin, there's many different kinds of plastic. You need to separate them out in the different kinds that you can recycle them individually. So that brings us to the second point on infrastructure, which is that for some types of plastic, it is not worthwhile economically. So let's say if if you have this plastic that is not that very common, it's not something that is used a lot, then it's very hard to recycle it because you don't have enough to actually sell to someone else to make into new products. So you end up just throwing it away or burning it. There's just way too many forms of plastics, and the only way to truly, really recycle a plastic is to bring it back to its chemical components and reform it. But that's actually very hard, so most of the time it's done via melting, and that doesn't really recycle it 100%. It's more of downcycling. So here's a very interesting thing that you definitely should know about if you want to look at recycling as a topic, which is China. So China actually had this wonderful system for recycling stuff for cheap, and they could recycle all sorts of things. So many countries ended up depending on China for many years by sending their trash there. Yeah, I know it sounds very weird, but China has a full-on recycling industry to make money from other people's trash. But the problem is, even though the people recycling them make some money, the government doesn't, because the Chinese government has to pay them subsidies and has to consider subsidies and also has to pay to clean up any messes that these factories are making, because some of them are not doing the process 100% cleanly and are releasing certain toxic materials into the streams, river streams and stuff like that. So it ends up creating more problems for the government, and they had to spend a lot more money than they really needed to in order to clean up the messes of the individual factories. And that's why they decided to stop importing trash. And that became a problem for the countries that were very dependent on China to recycle their trash. And now they either have to figure out how to do it domestically or send it somewhere else. Malaysia. Yeah, so some of them are now pushing it to Malaysia. So actually that brings us to the third point, which is the paragraph mentioning that recycling helps to reduce waste. As you can see, it does reduce waste, but it can sometimes create toxic waste, which is even more troublesome to clean up sometimes. Yeah, that's the problem. So now when it's brought to Malaysia, in some parts of Malaysia, you've already heard of news of certain factories being a bit illegal and dumping their toxic stuff into the river, and a bunch of school kids getting sick and all that. Yeah, I can see another problem festering up here. Well, what can I say? And recycling isn't as clean as it seems to be sometimes, especially if it's plastics recycling. Why does it always have to be plastic? Okay. And sometimes you can't recycle everything in the stream. You still have trash even after recycling some of it. And the stuff that isn't recycled just gets thrown away in the end. And yeah, the other problem is, it reduces waste from, if you see, oh, okay, it's used for another product. for certain things, you can only recycle it a certain number of times, especially plastics, because plastics don't usually get recycled back to its original quality and is instead downcycled. What that means is you use the plastic, let's say you take plastic from a bottle, but you don't make a bottle with it. You use it to make some sort of a block or something for construction or some other purpose. You don't use it to make more bottles. So that means you end up needing new plastic just to make more bottles. And that really doesn't help. Yeah. So, you aren't exactly reducing waste. You're just delaying the throwing of that waste. So unless it's something like aluminium or glass, you really don't get much out of recycling certain products. Yeah. That's why industrial recycling is quite important, because most of the times industrial waste is actually like, for example, if you're making metal furniture, then what they do is they cut out the metal shapes from the sheet, and then the rest of it is the waste. But it's actually still new metal, so it's not so bad. You can easily recycle it back and form new sheets. So that kind of thing is definitely worthwhile. It must be done, so that the waste isn't generated just from cutting out and throwing the rest, kind of thing. But if it's something like a plastic bottle, food container, plastic bag, it goes through usage. People use it for something. And the fact that it's being used makes it less structurally sound when you try to melt it and reform the plastic. So that's the main problem. Yeah, so that brings us to the last point, which is, the paragraph saying that it seems like it will help us save the planet, right? Well, the thing is, yeah, this in a sense does help to decrease the usage of certain materials, especially in the industry sense, and maybe prevent the production of, even more material than we are producing now. In a way, you do realize recycling itself is actually quite energy intensive. So, like, even if you do spend, like, you do still have to use some energy to make the product. Of course, for the most part, it is generally less energy intensive than making new product. But if you're downcycling the item, then you can't really compare it to making new product, because those two things are completely different. Yeah, so in some cases, it can even be worse than making virgin plastic, for example. It's usually with plastic that you get this disparity. For glass and metal, I think it's still generally better to recycle it. I I saw like data that, for example, aluminium really saves a lot of energy when you recycle it, because aluminium is made through electrophoresis, right? It's not really like iron or something which you just burn in a furnace or something. You heat up in a furnace. Usually, aluminium is made through electricity, and I think that's quite energy intense too. Yeah, so that's why recycling it is a lot better, because you just need to heat it up enough to melt it and then reform it. But speaking of aluminium, there is still an issue, which is that apparently with aluminium cans, it's not just the aluminium that needs to be recycled. There is usually a plastic film inside the can. And that's the bigger problem than the aluminium itself. The aluminium can easily be recycled, but the plastic, that's not gonna be that easy to recycle, because like this really thin film of plastic, and the fact that it's stuck onto the aluminium makes things a bit worse. Yeah, so that's something to consider. But you can still recycle your cans if you are able to. Yeah. Anyways, just something to consider before we move on to the next point. We heard about waste to energy in a previous episode on energy solutions, and we also have a few waste to energy plants here in Singapore, and that's pretty much what we do. More than recycling, we tend to burn all of our trash in Semakau. Sorry, and send the ash to Semakau. But is it really better than recycling? Is that a possibility that waste to energy could actually be better than recycling? That's what I thought. Like, that's the question that came to my mind. And yeah, we can definitely say that waste to energy is better than just straight up dumping the stuff into the landfill, because it saves space. It at least makes some energy out of the trash. But the thing is, we need to compare it with recycling now. So one of the things that we can consider that is that WTE, I'm just going to say WTE, works with stuff that cannot be recycled. So like your food waste, your biohazardous stuff, and all that stuff. But you know what? Let's look at plastics specifically. So based on what I see from the other stuff that I've told about plastics, as you can see, plastics are a bit hard to recycle in some senses. It's really all about the current infrastructure and practical constraints. So let's say if you don't have any practical constraints and you can very easily recycle all the plastics economically and infrastructure wise. So economics is very important here, because sometimes a country may feel like, okay, we should try to recycle stuff, but you won't be able to get people to recycle stuff unless they can make money out of it. That's really a big deal when it comes to infrastructure and building more plants to recycle things. That's why certain stuff never really get recycled, because you cannot make money out of it. So in that scenario, well, you might as well just burn it. Like, that's the next best thing you can do. But yeah, like, I know there are some places in Europe that don't really seem to like having WTE. Even though they have it, like, that's the thing that they have, but there are some people who are like, no, we shouldn't use this as a solution. This is not a replacement for recycling. We should instead aim for zero waste and try our best to recycle everything. So what I think would be the best way to do it is to have both. Have both WTE and recycling, because that's the most practical and most economical way of looking at it, I feel. Because we still have a lot of stuff that cannot be recycled, like bio waste and food waste and things like that. And all of those food containers that are contaminated with food. So in that sense, you can still have a lot of use for WTE. So the way that I think would be the best way is to first get out the metals and the glass that you can easily take from the recycling bin, and anything that cannot be recycled and plastics that are a bit harder to recycle can be put into the incinerator and burned first. And from there, you can then retrieve any leftover metals or something that you can easily retrieve with a magnet to recycle again. Or if the metals, generally they tend to melt rather than burn. So if there's any molten pieces of metal, you can try recycling them too. So in that sense, you save a bit of landfill space by burning stuff, and also get a bit of energy out of the WTE. And you know what came to my mind? Like, wow, it's not really the most Eureka-ish moment ever, but you could use the energy from the WTE to run the recycling plant. That doesn't sound bad, right? Like, it sounds like a great idea. You can have both in the same location. Isn't that a great idea? I think they probably already have a place like that here, so I don't know. Anyways, so now let's move on to the next point, which is, the paragraph saying that recycling is easy. Yeah, well, here it does seem very easy to do so. Too easy, in fact. You've seen the horrors that you can find in the recycling bin of all places. You see like some very unusual, definitely not belonging stuff there in the recycling bin. And that means there isn't enough restrictions or enforcement that prevent people from dumping things that don't belong. So, this don't belong can be as tame as something that's actually quite clean, is just cannot be recycled, so they can just remove it from the stream in the recycling plant, to something that is contaminated, which would render the entire bunch of stuff non-recyclable. I think in general, if there's contamination, then they can't even recycle the whole bunch, even if there's recyclable stuff in there. And that's really sad, like, you went there and put your stuff there to recycle, but you thought your stuff will get recycled, but your neighbor put something that shouldn't be recycled, and it's like a food container that's strewn with like sauce and stuff on it. And in the end, your stuff also doesn't get recycled because the sauce gets onto your stuff. Yeah, so that's the problem here. So even with the website, like actually NEA has a PDF that tells you what cannot be recycled. But who is gonna go read that? No one is gonna read it. And that's kind of sad. But and even if they put a sticker on the side of the bin to tell you, even people who are somewhat more aware do have some confusion. Like even I'm confused sometimes what can be really recycled. So yeah, that this leads to two kinds of actions. Either you completely don't recycle because you're too frustrated to figure out what is recyclable and not, or two, you're just complacent and you just dump whatever you think is recyclable. Basically, you end up recycling the wrong things. Well, hopefully most people don't end up recycling food containers, I mean contaminated food containers, and mostly end up just putting things that maybe aren't recyclable but are not completely contaminated. Yeah. So yeah, that's Singapore. And Singapore has really low levels of domestic household recycling. So let's look at other places. Well, in many places, the recycling rates are a bit better because, especially in places in which you have sorting of the recyclables, because then you don't end up contaminating everything. You only look at certain streams, and especially glass and metals can be easily recycled. But there's still confusion on what can be recycled, and sometimes there are some places in which that's right. Maybe one city you can recycle this object, in another city you cannot because they don't have the infrastructure to recycle that object. And on the plant side of things, the recycling plant, well, places like here where we do single stream recycling, which is putting everything in one go, is going to be troublesome for the plant because they have to sort out everything. And I can imagine just how much of a headache that is. And they do have some fancy machines to help them with the job, but there's actually still problems. Like for example, if you have plastics of many different kinds, there could be some that just you need to like really sort them out and make sure that you don't have anything that cannot be melted with the rest of the plastic. Or if you have glass, sometimes the glass can break within the recycling bin, and that can be very troublesome, and they can't even recycle it because it's just too many bits and pieces of glass, and that kind of messes up everything else. So that's another kind of contamination that can ruin the recycling stuff in a sense. In a single stream, that's a big issue. But if you can figure out all of this, then I guess it's down to economics. If you are able to make money out of it, it will happen. If you cannot make money out of it, it doesn't happen. That's the simplest way to look at it in practical terms. And as I mentioned earlier, there are some things that you need to recycle in a special facility like e-waste and the window panes and all that stuff. And actually in e-waste, there's a lot of valuable metals in your laptops and your smartphones. And by valuable, I legit mean it. There's stuff like palladium, platinum, gold, silver, niobium. Wait, is it? No, sorry, not niobium. Neodymium, which is the magnetic stuff. And, many other useful metals that are actually being mined from the earth every day just to be used in these electronic products. But many electronic products are not being recycled and they're just thrown in the landfill. So there's a lot of money just sitting there in the landfill waiting to be recovered. And that's like, that's crazy, right? Imagine the amount of money that's there in all of those laptops and phones, and all you really need to do is take them and recycle them to reuse the metals. So are we doomed to a lifetime of piling trash? Well, no, hopefully not. But it's important to note that in the 3 R's, I think I mentioned this already, the 3 R's, which are reduce, reuse, and recycle. Well, reduce is the first thing, so you must look at that first. That's the most important thing to do before you look at reuse and recycle. Why? Well, the most effective way to decrease waste is to not use a product to begin with, which is kind of like prevention is better than cure. So you prevent getting the product into making the product into waste so that you don't have to cure it. Yeah, it sounds a bit weird, but it's very similar to prevention is better than cure. You reduce using the stuff so that you don't have to figure out how to deal with as much stuff. I hope I made sense. Okay. So what can you do? You can maybe buy lesser new stuff, like don't buy so many new clothes or new accessories or new things in general. I mean, it depends. Like, if you really need to buy something, then buy it, I guess. Don't be like me. And only buy what you need. And you can also look at, lobbying or asking companies to use less plastic or less packaging on their products, because there are certain cases in the US where they literally just wrap single bananas and oranges and stuff. And I'm just like, why? Why do you need to do that? Which is why, the way that we do things here sometimes with the fruits and stuff, all nicely, we can pick up what we want and put them in a plastic bag. That kind of system is a lot better in terms of the packaging stuff. And if you replace the plastic bags with whatever we have at home, our own, maybe we can reuse plastic bags from last time or reuse a container. That will make it even better in that way. But I'm not sure how accepted it is here in terms of the shopping center, because you usually end up using the plastic bags that are there in the rolled up form. And yeah, we ourselves should, if we use reusable containers, we can, reduce using disposable containers. So I'm not really going to talk about reusable straws, because apparently making the straw is even more intensive than just using some plastic straws. So I'm not going to talk about that. And also for the reusable tote bags that you only use for groceries, unless you use it many, 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 many times, the environmental impact of the tote bag may be worse than a lot of plastic bags. So I don't know. And the fact that we actually reuse plastic bags already makes the tote bag worse than the plastic bag sometimes. So yeah, so use your reusable containers, because that's the most practical one, because you'll be using a lot of times, that's for sure. So you can use it to take away or tapao food, or bring food from home or whatever it is, and use your own cutlery as well, because you anyway are going to use the cutlery, so might as well use it outside as well. So you reduce the usage of disposable cutleries and disposable containers. So that's one way to that's the way to actually so-called reduce. And apart from this, maybe using biodegradable packaging or biodegradable products will reduce the use of things that will actually need recycling or reusing in the sense. So after reducing, if you really cannot reduce the things, maybe try reusing it, which I think Asian mentality already makes us do that. We reuse our plastic bags for the trash can. That's actually better than trying to recycle them sometimes, or like trying to use a reusable tote bag. And reusing glass containers, maybe you buy your, I don't know, like pickles or something, and you get a glass container, or like tomato sauce for your pasta or something like that. So you can use that glass container to hold something else, because glass is quite useful for cooking and storing food, and also for storing other things. And also reusing metal containers, like your tin cans, the biscuit tins used for sewing set, that kind of thing. But plastic is a bit debatable, because sometimes they don't hold up very well after a few uses, especially with the detergent and everything. But if it works, and if it's really sturdy, high quality plastic, then feel free to use it a few times before you actually end up throwing it. Of course, this still comes after reducing. So if you cannot reduce it, you only try to reuse it if you cannot reduce using the object, in a sense, yeah. So so yeah, but about the plastic bag and the clothes bag, well, you can look at the link below for more information. And finally, after reusing, the final thing that you can do is recycling. So what are two ways to recycle? Either you do it yourself, basically you upcycle something, make it do some arts and crafts, or use it for another, like you invent something with it, I don't know, make your own contraption with your old trash basically. Or you let the country do it for you, put it in a blue bin and hope that it gets recycled and no one put any contaminated stuff in it. Yeah, so that's recycling. As you can see, recycling we just explored has many practical constraints and problems, so it's better if we manage to, reduce and reuse before we even consider recycling it. Yeah, so if it can be recycled, then yes, of course it goes in the trash. At least the WTE will do something to it. So that's the conclusion. Recycling isn't as rosy as it seems on the surface. But hey, it's still better than doing nothing sometimes, and it's rather effective for stuff like aluminium cans and glass because even if we do try to, so-called reuse the containers, we don't need that many. Eventually, you have too many and you want to recycle them. So, yeah, at least that can be easily recycled compared to plastics. So yeah, that's about it. I think structure of this whole episode was pretty good. I mean, that's my opinion. If you don't think that's a good structure, then you can tell me. And I hope you learn a bit more about recycling, and it is more than just something that is a good practice or something that is inherently good and nothing there's no badness to it. There is still some badness to it in certain cases, or there's still some constraints to make it an inherently good process. But at the end of the day, it is still worthwhile doing to some extent, especially if you are recycling your glass or metal containers. As for plastics, if it's something that is very commonly used and can be recycled, then do recycle it. If it's something that's a bit less commonly used, try to go for reducing or reusing the material rather than just recycling it. So yeah, because it may end up just going to the landfill in the end. So, yeah, that's about it. I hope you found this episode useful. If you did, please press the like button and subscribe. And with that, I would like to say thank you and bye.